Deep within the shadowed valleys beyond the dwellings of mortal men, Enoch walked through the mist-shrouded ancient forest. He sensed unseen eyes observing his every step, heavy with a weight that belonged not to the earth. The silence of the woods was absolute, broken only by the crunch of dry leaves beneath the prophet's feet. Enoch paused, his eyes penetrating the darkness, as he called out into the quiet air, demanding those who watched him to reveal themselves. Slowly, majestic yet broken figures emerged from behind the ancient trunks, their celestial radiance obscured by a dark, lingering haze. These were the Watchers, angels who once sang in the highest heavens, now bearing the bitter grief of their irreversible fall. Their leader stepped forward, his eyes reflecting a centuries-old pain, as he acknowledged Enoch by his lineage, the son of Jared. The fallen angels gathered around the righteous man, seeking the warmth of a divine grace they had long lost. Enoch looked upon their sorrowful faces and questioned why beings of celestial origin were seeking an audience with a mortal. The fallen leader spoke, remembering a time when their voices echoed through the heavens and their praise was heard by the Most High. He confessed that the light of grace had been taken from them, and a consuming darkness was slowly swallowing their once immortal spirit. Enoch reminded them that their current suffering was the direct result of their own deliberate rebellion against the Almighty. The Watchers pleaded with Enoch, knowing that the light of the Creator still burned brightly within his righteous heart. They begged him to act as their intercessor, to carry their plea for mercy and forgiveness before the throne of the Altísimo. Enoch asked why he should intercede for spirits who had crossed a boundary established from the foundation of the world. The Watchers replied that their time was waning, and the divine light that once covered their faces was fading into eternal shadow. They acknowledged that mankind knew of their transgression, but humanity did not know the full, tragic story of their fall. Enoch stood silently before them, listening as the Watchers began to reveal the hidden history of the Forbidden Pact. In the beginning, the Watchers were assigned one of the most complex tasks given to divine beings to observe the creation below. Their duty was not merely to watch the cosmos, but to oversee humanity, weak, finite, and imperfect creatures of clay. Yet, despite human weakness, the Watchers found the existence of mankind deeply fascinating and strangely enchanting. For ages, they contemplated the magnificent work of the Altísimo from the exaltation of their heavenly abode. They watched rivers carve through the earth, wild beasts roam under the sun, and men build humble tents for their families. They observed mortals weep for their dead, sing around flickering fires, and gaze up at the stars without understanding. At first, the Watchers looked upon humanity with pure wonder, like one gazes at a freshly lit lamp in the dark. Over centuries, that innocent wonder began to curdle into a dangerous, subtle envy of human experience. The vast distance separating the divine beings from mortals ceased to feel holy and began to feel deeply unfair. The Watchers questioned why mortals could touch and feel the earth while the angels were destined only to observe from afar. They envied humanity's ability to feel cold rain on their skin, the weight of hunger, and the warmth of a mother's touch. The angels did not age, they did not bleed, and they did not fear death, yet they envied the very fragility of human life. That envy was the subtle beginning of their downfall, the loss of gratitude for the exalted place they held. No lightning struck them down in that moment, and no archangel banished them from the celestial realm just yet. They were still called the Watchers, but they no longer observed with obedience, they observed with burning desire. Each day they looked further down toward the earth, and listened less to the voice echoing from the throne above. Some kept silent in their growing temptation, while others began to justify the unholy desires blooming in their hearts. What began as innocent curiosity evolved into logical arguments, and those arguments soon transformed into a perceived right. They told themselves that they loved humanity, that they wished to descend only to teach, protect, and guide mortals. Beneath these noble justifications lay a darker truth. They craved what the Creator had not granted to their order. When a created spirit stops receiving its assigned measure as a gift, it begins to view its boundaries as a prison. Eventually, the Watchers gathered around their chief, not because he was the purest, but because he possessed the voice to unite them. They asked him to give speech to the forbidden desire they all harbored, but feared to speak aloud. The chief leader knew he should have remained silent, reminded them of the holy boundary, and trembled at the thought of crossing it. Instead, his voice became the binding cord that tied their collective desires into an irrevocable decision. He proposed that if they were to descend, they must not do so individually, for individual action would bring doubt and repentance. If one fell alone, the others would condemn him. But if all fell together, none would have the moral strength to accuse another. Thus, on the high summits of Mount Hermon, the Forbidden's oath was born, not out of courage, but out of shared cowardice. They stood on the threshold of divine boundary, fully aware that crossing it would break something eternal. The leader uttered the solemn oath, and one by one, 200 celestial beings voiced their agreement into the night. They swore not to abandon their purpose, not to turn back, and to bear the crushing weight of their guilt together. They mistakenly believed that their oath would make them strong, but it only rendered them incapable of repenting. That night, before their feet ever touched the dust of the earth, their spirits had already fallen from grace. The fall of the Watchers did not begin when they landed on earthly soil. It began when they were rebelled against the Creator. Following that oath came the physical descent, their interactions with mortal women, and the secrets unveiled to mankind. Then came the monstrous offspring born of their unnatural union, whose violence caused the earth itself to cry out for justice. Yet all those horrors were merely the fruit, while the root remained hidden in the desire to be more than they were created to be. The Watchers admitted to Enoch that they summoned him not to deny their guilt, but to discover if any mercy remained. They longed to know if the Altissimo looked upon their ruin with wrath alone, or if a single word of pardon existed in his judgment. Enoch stood in profound silence, realizing that the words of the fallen chief were not those of a proud rebel, but of a broken spirit. The prophet turned his gaze toward another Watcher, who stepped forward to describe how the corruption materialized on earth. This second Watcher recalled the moment of their descent with a terrifying clarity that centuries had failed to erase. He described the descent not as a physical journey through space, but as an existential abandonment of a holy state of being. Crossing that invisible threshold meant forfeiting their celestial nature to step into a realm never intended for them. As they descended through the atmosphere, every instinct warned them that each moment took them further from home. Yet none among the 200 possessed the courage to halt their descent or bear the shame of breaking the oath. When their feet finally touched the cold stone of the mountain peak, they looked upon the earthly realm from a new perspective. Up close, the trees, the rivers, and the human habitations appeared far more vivid and intense than from the heavens. It was in that moment that the Watcher realized the true peril they faced, for the earth was dangerously beautiful. Many believe the fall occurred because the angels encountered earthly filth, but in truth, they first encountered beauty. When beauty is sought outside the sovereign will of the Creator, it transforms into a snare more deadly than darkness itself. The Watchers walked unseen through human settlements, observing families building shelters and mourning their dead. They saw mortal men struggle against harsh winters, yet preserve hope and love within their fragile communities. The angels began to convince themselves that the eternal separation between heaven and earth had been an unnecessary restriction. Subtle deception grew within their minds as they claimed humanity needed their superior wisdom and celestial guidance. They spoke less of obedience to the divine law and focused entirely on their own desires and ambitions. Disobedience rarely presents itself as a grotesque monster. It almost always arrives disguised as a noble intention. Gradually, the watchers ceased merely watching. They began revealing themselves and walking openly among men. The more time they spent immersed in human life, the harder it became to remember the holy purpose of their creation. It was then that their eyes fell upon the daughters of men, captivating them with their mortal grace and vulnerability. Their desire was not sudden, it was the final manifestation of a spiritual rot that had been growing for ages. Some were captivated by physical beauty, others by fragility, and others by the urge to possess what was forbidden. The divine boundary dissolved completely, and what once seemed unthinkable became, in their minds, entirely inevitable. The watcher confessed his own silent guilt, acknowledging that watching sin unfold without stopping it makes one complicit. When that sacred boundary was finally breached and celestial spirits united with mortal flesh, the foundation of the world cracked. The transformation was not marked by immediate thunder or visible signs, but by an internal collapse of cosmic order. Enoch listened with growing uneasiness, realizing that sin was not merely a single act, but an expanding tear in reality. He then turned to another watcher, whose face was hardened like cold iron, known throughout human legend as Azazel. Azazel spoke, acknowledging that his name was uttered by generations of men, though few understood the true nature of his deed. He explained that when they first walked among men, the watchers foolishly believed they could control the consequences of their actions. They arrogantly assumed they could indulge their forbidden desires while retaining the holiness of their former state. No creature can cross a boundary set by the Creator and remain unchanged. Transgression always demands more than it promises. Azazel observed primitive men struggling with crude wooden tools, fighting against a nature they could barely comprehend. He allowed pride to whisper in his heart, questioning why beings of supreme knowledge should withhold secrets from mankind. His desire to teach did not spring from genuine compassion, but from a vainglorious wish to be worshipped as a benefactor. Azazel began to uncover the deep secrets of the earth, teaching men how to mine and refine hidden metals from the mountains. He showed them how to forge iron into deadly swords, shields, armor, and sharp blades designed for bloodshed. Mortals marveled at these revelations, as tasks that once required generations were suddenly accomplished with ease. Azazel felt a surge of pride seeing human faces filled with awe, falsely believing he was elevating human civilization. This is the supreme danger of pride. It masquerades as enlightenment, progress, and essential liberation. Yet every forbidden secret delivered prematurely corrupts not only the hands of the receiver, but the intent of his heart. With forged metals came the birth of warfare, conquest, tyranny, and the systematic destruction of neighboring tribes. Humanity learned to craft instruments of death, and with those instruments, violence multiplied across the continents. Other watchers followed Azazel's lead, revealing the movements of stars, the arts of enchantment, and forbidden sorceries. Great cities arose, gleaming with new technology and ancient magic, but alongside knowledge grew unprecedented wickedness. Greed, lust for power, and the desire to dominate others consumed the hearts of kings and commoners alike. The watchers refused to halt their instruction because admitting error would mean acknowledging the perfection of God's original boundary. They preferred to delude themselves into thinking they could manage the chaos, even as control slipped entirely from their hands. Generations of humans began to venerate the fallen angels, building altars and offering sacrifices to their new masters. Feeding on human adoration, the hearts of the watchers grew increasingly warped and alienated from the divine truth. Azazel revealed to Enoch that the worst secret he gave to humanity was not the art of war, but power divorced from divine wisdom. That ancient curse remains alive in the human heart to this day, seeking domination without moral restraint. As forbidden knowledge spread, a far more terrifying consequence began to mature upon the surface of the earth. Another watcher, Seraphil, stepped forward, his eyes filled with the haunting memory of an unimaginable horror. He spoke not of the desire or the secrets, but of the monstrous offspring born from their unnatural unions. When the first children of the Watchers and mortal women were born, the fallen angels initially felt a sense of foolish pride. They looked upon these infants, who grew at an abnormal rate, believing they were pioneering a glorious new race of demigods. The children possessed extraordinary strength and towering stature, inspiring both awe and dread in the hearts of human mothers. Yet as years passed, that awe turned into sheer terror, for the growth of these beings knew no natural limits. They became the Nephilim, giants of immense height whose physical power dwarfed the greatest mortal warriors. The appetite of the Nephilim was insatiable, consuming the agricultural yield of entire nations in a matter of days. Whole populations labored continuously just to feed a handful of giants, yet their hunger remained unquenched. When the crops and livestock were exhausted, the giants turned their terrifying appetites upon humanity itself. Seraphil recalled witnessing peaceful villages stripped of all food, and human families slaughtered to satisfy the Nephilim. The giants inherited not only the vast power of their angelic fathers, but also their cosmic pride and rebellion. They viewed the world as their personal playground, enslaving mortals and clashing against one another in apocalyptic battles. Blood saturated the soil of the earth to a degree never before witnessed since the creation of the world. The earth itself seemed to groan under the crushing weight of the Nephilim, crying out to the heavens for relief. The Watchers realized with horror that they had not elevated humanity, but had spawned a cosmic monstrosity. They had introduced utter chaos into a finely tuned creation, shattering the delicate balance ordained by the Altissimo. For the first time, profound terror struck the hearts of the Watchers, not for their own fate, but for the ruin they caused. Seraphil confessed that sin never remains confined to the sinner. It inevitably spills over to devastate the innocent. The Nephilim were not the original cause of the tragedy. They were the terrifying physical proof of angelic rebellion. Hearing these harrowing confessions, Enoch understood the subtle thread that bound all their stories together. The prophet looked upon the fallen spirits and spoke with divine clarity, cutting through their centuries of self-pity. Enoch declared that their fall did not begin with the giants, the women, or the forbidden secrets of technology. It began the exact moment they allowed dissatisfaction with the Creator's sovereign will to take root in their hearts. When a created being ceases to be content with its appointed realm, gratitude dies and ambition takes its place. Enoch reminded them that their rebellion was born of pride, the foolish belief that their will was superior to God's law. Humanity was now repeating that exact same error, chasing power and pleasure while abandoning the Creator's boundaries. Enoch recognized that the Watchers were not seeking history, but were desperately asking if hope and mercy still existed. Though moved by their tragic state, Enoch stated that he could not grant them pardon, for judgment belongs to God alone. Yet, he agreed to fulfill their request, promising to ascend the holy mountain and present their petition before the Altissimo. The Watchers stood in total silence as Enoch turned and departed from the dark forest, bearing their desperate plea. The prophet journeyed far from human civilization, ascending into the high, desolate peaks of the sacred mountain. With every step upward, the sounds of the earthly realm faded, replaced by the biting wind and profound solitude. For days and nights, Enoch remained on the rocky summit, fasting, praying, and seeking the presence of the Creator. He pondered the tragedy of Semyosa, Araquil, Azazel, and Seraphil, remembering their tears and their absolute ruin. He realized that none of their choices were accidental. They had knowingly breached boundaries established in holiness. Yet Enoch continued to pray, wondering if divine mercy could reach down into the deepest abyss of spiritual rebellion. On the seventh day, As the stars aligned over the mountain peak, an overwhelming presence descended upon the height. It was not accompanied by earthly thunder, but by a holy weight so immense that reality itself seemed to bow. Enoch fell prostrate on the cold stone, overwhelmed by the vast distance between the uncreated God and created beings. Then, a voice echoed through his spirit, speaking with absolute authority that sustained the existence of the cosmos. The Altissimo addressed Enoch, acknowledging that he had heard the plea of the Watchers who abandoned their heavenly realm. The voice proclaimed that the Watchers acquired wisdom only after their deliberate act of rebellion was complete. Their repentance was not born of love for holiness, but of the bitter harvest produced by their own sin. They were not deceived, nor were they ignorant. They knew their holy estate and chose to abandon it for earthly lust. Therefore, the voice declared with absolute finality, the divine judgment rendered against them remains unalterable. The Creator revealed to Enoch the true nature of their loss, explaining that their punishment was not merely loss of power. Their ultimate tragedy was the eternal loss of his divine presence, the only true source of life and joy for any spirit. They sought satisfaction outside his will and found only an infinite, agonizing emptiness that could never be filled. The voice commanded Enoch to return and deliver the final verdict. There would be no absolution, no ascension, and no restoration. The sacred presence slowly withdrew, leaving Enoch alone on the silent, wind-swept peak under the glowing stars. The prophet wept, carrying a burden heavier than the mountain itself, knowing he held the final death knell of angelic hope. He descended the rugged slopes, taking slow, deliberate steps back toward the ancient forest where the fallen awaited. When Enoch entered the dark woods, he found the 200 watchers standing motionless in the shadows. None spoke a word as the prophet approached, for their immortal spirits already felt the shadow of the final decree. Enoch stood before them, looking into the eyes of beings who had once shone like the morning stars in heaven. He delivered the words of the Altissimo faithfully, declaring that because they chose their own will, judgment stood forever. A profound, suffocating silence descended upon the forest, heavier than any physical weight in the universe. Some watchers bowed their heads, others closed their eyes in silent agony, but not a single voice was raised in protest. Centuries of suffering had stripped away their pride, leaving only the crushing realization of their eternal ruin. Enoch then shared the final revelation, explaining that their greatest loss was not celestial glory, but divine communion. Those words pierced the hearts of the fallen angels deeper than the decree of judgment itself. They finally understood that by abandoning the Creator, they had doomed themselves to an eternity of absolute spiritual death. One by one, the watchers sank into the shadows of the forest, realizing that no second chance would ever be granted. Enoch turned away for the last time, walking out of the dark woods as the first light of dawn broke over the horizon. The golden sunlight illuminated the fields, rivers, and homes of men, signaling the continuation of human history. Enoch realized that the story of the Watchers was a perpetual warning for every generation of humanity that would follow. The temptation to break God's covenant, to seek power and pleasure outside His will, remains the ultimate human trap. The fallen angels traded eternal life in the light for a brief moment of earthly desire, losing everything in the process. As Enoch walked toward the human world, the lesson of the fallen watchers was etched forever into the sacred scriptures. It stands as a timeless testament that pride leads to ruin, and true life is found only in obedience to the Altissimo.